Thank you all so much. I will say I am always I'm very grateful to follow Alan because I know everyone's already been to church. The pressure is off of me. It's great in that sense. Um, would you all pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be found acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Growing up in a Baptist church in Tidewater, Virginia, meant that I had the privilege to get to know Mike Haywood. Mike was and remains one of those people who seems eternal and timeless. He worked for the Peninsula Baptist Association, or PBA, as we called it. If the PBA was organizing or leading something, Mike probably had a hand in it. I first met Mike as a kid attending PBA's summer sports camp, a ministry that Mike started. For 8 to 10 weeks out of the summer, Mike, along with a cadre of youth and a couple additional adults, would lead a sports camp that rotated weekly between local Baptist churches. Youth would lead various age groups of children around to various stations led by other youth. When I became a youth, there were many summers where I volunteered a couple of weeks with Mike at summer camp, leading in rotations. I often led the baseball station, which can be rather tricky when you have groups of 5 and 6-year-olds as well as groups of 11 and 12-year-olds. Mike was always willing to help, but he was known for taking a hands-off approach to leading sports camp. He was the picture guy. After he screamed songs along with the kids in the morning, Mike would take a few hundred photos. He would sweat through his t-shirt. He would change his t-shirt. He would take a few more hundred photos, sweat through his t-shirt, change his t-shirt, and then take a few more hundred photos to round out the afternoon. Mike justified his picture taking, saying, "I know how to lead these various sports rotations. If I do it, how are you going to learn?" This mentality really shaped Mike's whole approach to working with children and youth. Sometimes the games or drills we tried at sports camp worked wonderfully. A lot of times they failed, but we learned from our mistakes, and no mistake was too big that we could not fix it. By my recollection, nearly every sports camp that I ever attended or helped volunteer, which is kind of crazy, every single one had the same themed Bible verse. It was Luke 2:52, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. It was an apt verse, not only for the children, but also for the volunteers, who Mike empowered and encouraged to grow and learn through our volunteering. On this Sunday, only a few days after Christmas, the scheduled lectionary readings for many Christian churches includes this passage about Jesus' childhood and concludes with this verse. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. This is the only story of Jesus' adolescence within the biblical text. While there may have been accounts of Jesus' childhood in apocryphal or Gnostic texts, this is the only passage we have in the accepted biblical canon of this period in Jesus' life. The story comes after the Gospel of Luke's classical Christmas story many of us know so well and have recently rehearsed through Advent. Mary receives word from an angel that she would give birth to a son who was to be called Jesus. Mary and Joseph go to Bethlehem in order of the Roman census. And there's no room for them in the inn, so Mary gives birth to Jesus in a manger. Shepherds in a nearby field are greeted by a choir of angels beckoning them to go and see the birth of Jesus. None of the other Gospels tell of such a miraculous and fantastical story. Luke sets the stage for the birth of Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. As soon as we are told this classical story of Christmas that prophesies of Jesus as the Son of God, whose kingdom will have no end, we hear a story of Jesus' childhood. We are encouraged to consider what it means for God incarnate to grow up, to be human. After the miraculousness of his birth, Luke reminds us of the mundane and the ordinary. Jesus had to grow up. The gospel writer shares this story about 12-year-old Jesus, who may have been a little more mischievous than we might have expected. Every year, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus went to the temple in Jerusalem for Passover. This was the center of Jewish life, where individuals made sacrifices to God. This was the literal house of God where Jews believed God resided. Jesus had made the journey and the trip many times before, according to the gospel writer, but this year, at the age of 12, instead of packing up and traveling back with his family, Jesus decided to hang back at the temple and not tell his parents. It seems Jesus was well aware of the principle, don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. He must have had a tendency for being an outgoing and extroverted child, since Mary and Joseph were not concerned when he initially went missing. It took them an entire day before they began to suspect something was amiss. They checked with the usual suspects, Jesus' friends and extended family, and when they could not find him, they knew something was wrong. Panic-stricken and anxious, undoubtedly, Joseph and Mary turned around and returned to Jerusalem to look for Jesus. It took an additional 3 days to find Jesus in the temple. I am sure that they wondered if history would remember them as the two young parents who lost the 12-year-old Son of God. I wonder what Jesus must have been doing during these 4 days as well. Yes, Mary and Joseph found him in the temple listening and asking questions, but he wasn't doing that for 96 hours straight. Did Jesus get up to any antics in the big city of Jerusalem, much like Macaulay Culkin's character Kevin in the classic Christmas Home Alone 2? Did Jesus have any doubts and concerns himself? When Jesus finally is reunited with his parents, he does what any child would do. He gaslights Mary and Joseph, questioning their concern and suggesting that obviously he would have been in the temple in his father's house. It seems the 12-year-old Jesus had hit puberty a little early with some well-honed teenage attitude. What strikes me as reading this story at the end of 2024 is where Mary and Joseph looked for Jesus and where they found Jesus. When they began to have some concern that something wasn't quite right, they looked for Jesus among relative and friends. Certainly, Jesus had been found among family and friends before, but in this story, Jesus was not to be found there. Instead, they found Jesus in the temple, in a place of organized religion, in a place of organized community. Anyone who has been paying attention to organized religion in the United States knows that congregational attendance has been in decline for quite some time. This decline has been perhaps more obvious in cities like New York for far longer than in other parts of the country. In a Faith Communities Today survey, since 2000, the median attendance of religious congregation has declined from 137 to 65. A Gallup survey from this year says 3 in 10 Americans attend religious services regularly, jumping up to 4 in 10 if you include individuals who attend at least once a month. There are some indications that this decline has reached a plateau, but even those indications are far too early to be certain. The phenomenon is not only affecting religious congregations, but all sorts of organizations and membership societies that are seeing declines in membership. The sociologist Robert Putnam diagnosed this decline in the 1990s in his well-known sociological study, Bowling Alone, later released as a book, where he observed the decline of bowling leagues, but not a decline in the popularity of bowling alleys. People were bowling, they were just not doing it together. Putnam now has a new documentary on Netflix entitled Join or Die that chronicles his life as a Harvard political scientist. Putnam does not see this decline in bowling leagues as innocuous. He believes that bowling leagues and other clubs, organizations, churches are imperative for a democracy to thrive. They help individuals stay civically engaged. The documentary suggests these clubs and organizations help individuals build social capital and practice democracy, learning to live and interact with individuals of different beliefs and personalities. These types of organizations thrived in early America, causing the French observer Alexis de Tocqueville to describe America as a nation of joiners. When I read this story of Mary and Joseph finding Jesus rather at the temple rather than among family or friends, I'm reminded of Robert Putnam. I wonder if this particular narrative presents Jesus as a quasi-joiner. This is not to say this passage is about democracy or organized religion or even church attendance, but I think this passage presents an opportunity to think about Jesus the joiner at a time when Americans are not particularly inclined to be joiners. What might we learn from being found in the temple? The context of this story is important if we are to think about Jesus as joiner. We cannot accept this story at face value as a story that takes place in an otherwise mundane and ordinary world. Jesus was a child of empire. Luke establishes this from the very beginning. He was a Palestinian Jew living under Roman occupation. The angel tells Mary he will be great. He will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end. This is a prophecy that is very much at odds with the powers of Rome. And if the reader didn't catch this messianic prophecy against the Roman Empire in the first chapter, the second chapter begins, "In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world." Jesus was born a child of empire. There was a social contract when it came to Roman power. Rome and its territories and citizens would enjoy security, peace, and prosperity so long as due honor and obedience was afforded to the emperor. The empire demanded loyalty and sought to establish a clear power dynamic with its subjects. Through his life and beyond his death, Caesar Augustus was elevated to divine status by his followers and loyalists. Therefore, Jews like Jesus and his family occupied a precarious position under this imperial rule. Unwilling to worship the Roman ruler, Jews living in the Roman Empire were tolerated. They were allowed to practice their religion and go to the temple and make offerings to God. Such allowances, however, could be and were periodically revoked. Recognizing the context of this imperial oppression, what does it mean that Jesus chose to sit and listen and ask questions of the priests for 3 days in the temple at Passover? I think I've always considered this story to be of Jesus's spiritual and religious acumen. Jesus presented well-crafted theological opinions that amazed the priests. It's another thing entirely to consider the priests' amazement of Jesus's understanding of Jewish persecution living under Roman rule. Undoubtedly, the priests had discussions about their place within broader Roman imperial context. We see something similar in the American South, when formerly enslaved Black Americans organized politically through churches in the era of Reconstruction. Historian Nicole Myers Turner has researched how Black Baptist congregations in Virginia specifically became sites of political organizing. Turner shows how Black Americans secured property rights and land ownership more easily through religious congregations. Relying upon the First Amendment's guarantees of the freedom of religion, Black Baptists in Virginia secured land and built independent churches. These churches then became central gathering places for the recently emancipated Black population. Without other spaces in which to organize, the Black community utilized churches to organize politically. Living under the oppression of white supremacy and racism in late 19th century Virginia, Black Americans exercised their resistance out of their religious communities. Perhaps some of Jesus's conversations in the temple had a similar tone and purpose. Maybe there were conversations about how to navigate the politics living under Roman rule. Perhaps Jesus amazed the priests with an appeal to nonviolent protest. Maybe Jesus drew upon the Torah to question ideas that would have sacrificed the well-being of the marginalized for the sake of the wider community. Yes, Jesus was young, but not too young that he would not have understood that Rome held power over his small Jewish community. As we turn the page on 2024, we are set to witness the peaceful transfer of power that for many Americans will feel anything but peaceful. Roughly half the country is excited for the incoming presidential administration, and half the country is terrified. We know the pain and suffering that will likely come to marginalized communities, and it is easy to feel powerless and hopeless in anticipation for what we know is to come. Washington, D.C. can feel a very long way away. Sometimes I wonder if this feeling, whether justified or not, was felt by the other half of the country for the past 4 years, and what we can do to ensure that half the country doesn't feel this way every election cycle. Living under Roman rule, Mary and Joseph expected to find Jesus among friends and family as they made their way back from Jerusalem. It seems like a reasonable expectation. In tough times, friends and loved ones are important life-giving relationships, and we should not take them for granted. Spending time with friends and family, however, is different from being socially engaged. When I read this passage with my contemporary eyes, I cannot help but think it's significant that Jesus was found in the temple. I cannot help but think of Jesus, the joiner. As we look to 2025 in the next few days of resolution making, maybe we remember this narrative of Jesus, the joiner. Now, I'm well aware that I am very much preaching to the choir here, preaching about the value of attending church service at a all virtual service the Sunday or after Christmas. I am guessing you all are already very, very committed joiners already. So let's raise the ante. What would it look like for you to encourage someone else to be a joiner, to invite someone to church? Now, I know that is probably the most heretical thing I've said this morning. It's almost anathema for progressive religious circles to invite people to church. Inviting someone to church seems a little bit too pushy, doesn't it? A little bit too judgy. Um, I mean, they will know we are Christians by our love, right? If we just keep doing the good stuff that we're doing, they'll want to join. It's not surprising that conservative evangelical church attendees are statistically far more likely to invite individuals to church than mainline progressive congregations like Metro. In a world that feels so politically uncertain and dangerous, maybe we reconsider our invitations less as pushy or judgy and more as an opportunity to forge a community in the midst of political strife. But the temple is not always the best fit for everyone, and perhaps you would already invite someone who already comes to Metro. Perhaps you're thinking that you've reached your religious quota and you're not willing to entertain this heresy of inviting someone to church. Joining, however, is not limited to religious organizations. Maybe there's a community choir, a sports club, an interest group, a grassroots political organization in your orbit that you've been too nervous or hesitant to join. You're not sure you have enough time. You're worried how awkward those first few meetings might feel. Perhaps for 2025, you consider giving them a second chance. Building community is not easy, but in a world that seems to be unraveling all over, it's one of the only things that's worth building. As Rome flexed its imperial power across the Mediterranean, Mary and Joseph found 12-year-old Jesus in the temple, talking with his community's leaders. Where will you be found in 2025?